I want you to go boot up any open world game that makes use of the minimap and see how much time you spend gravitating towards the corner of the minimap. These days, minimaps can tell you pretty much everything. All the treasures, points of interest, quests, that Charizard card you lost when you were a kid. All you need is right there, right in that small corner of the map. And having a map is fine, but when you have too much information, there's no point in looking at the rest of the screen. You're spending so much time just staring at that little corner and not seeing the rest. You know, the one that the developers spent so much time, so many resources to making look good and pretty, and you're barely even looking at it. And it's because the game is not giving you the incentive to, because it's telling you all this information in this one little corner of the screen. And I had this revelation a few years ago playing The Witcher 3. Now, don't get me wrong, Witcher 3 is a phenomenal game and does so many things right, and yet it falls victim to the curse of the minimap. After several hours in, I realized I didn't really have much of a sense of direction when looking around the world. Instead of staring at this incredibly detailed world full of amazing visuals, I was just staring at a tiny corner of the screen to find things. And looking online, especially on Reddit, I found some posts about people struggling with the same thing. So at that point, I went my way to the options menu, and I turned it off. And the game became so much better. I was finally taking in the world. But there was still an issue with this. That when I turned off the minimap, I really realized there was a core development problem and design problem is these games are being built around the minimap or the quest marker. And it becomes very obvious when you try turning it off how it's a crutch for good game design. It becomes frustrating to play without the minimap. There are certain points where you have to go to very certain spots, and unless you have that map open, you're not going to find it. What you could do, of course, is just simply pause and look at the map, but that takes you a bit out of the game. Now, as a PC gamer, there was a partial solution for this. There was a mod for the immersive HUD that by hitting a button allowed me to just get rid of everything from the screen. And that's great. But there's an underlying issue there is the sense that, one, this is only available for PC gamers, so console gamers are out of the mix. This is a fan mod mix, not something by the developers, and how they can miss something as simple as this, it's really mind-boggling. And finally, the third point is it really doesn't address the underlying problem that how designers have become so reliant on the minimap. And that's a huge issue, but let's take a look at some other examples. Let's take a look at a game series that helped lead to a lot of this, and that being the Grand Theft Auto games. Now, Grand Theft Auto itself, they've always had that minimap, but as time has gone on, it started to get filled with more and more stuff. The game becomes a lot harder to find your way around. For example, with Grand Theft Auto 5, one of the best-selling games ever made, one of the most expensive games ever made, when playing it, I was in the same boat like Witcher 3, ended up staring at this corner. Now, for various missions, you have to go to very certain points, and it gets really, really tough to do if you're not following that map. Again, you could turn it off, but then you're going to have to go back and forth. Now, what's interesting is, Grand Theft Auto 4 had a solution to get you to keep your eyes on the road, but it got removed from Grand Theft Auto 5. And what I'm talking about is the GPS system, or specifically, the GPS voice system. For Grand Theft Auto 4, like Google Maps, you can have it tell you where to go and when to turn.
In 100 yards, turn right. In 200 yards, turn left.
And that's great. That way you can keep your eye on the road. And that's not featured in Grand Theft Auto 5. There is a GPS, but there is no voice directions. And I'm frankly puzzled to why Rockstar took this out. Were not enough players using it? And to also be fair, it did lead you to take the safe routes when necessary and allowed you to follow traffic laws. As we know in Grand Theft Auto, that's not something the user will usually do. But in this case, I'm still surprised that they went backwards on this. And on a Rockstar related note, while this was not developed by them, it was published. LA Noire had a great solution to get away from staring at the minimap. When you're driving with a partner, you could get them to give you directions instead of staring at the minimap. They would tell you when to turn left and when to turn right. And that way you could keep your eye on the road and get to understand the world. And of course there were still some issues where various missions had you tailing people, and unless you're looking at the mini-map, it was going to be very difficult to make sure that you're the right distance away. And on another note, with Rockstar, let's look at Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2. Now, I beat the first Red Dead Redemption without the mini-map, and this was fairly easy to do. Now, that is because the game has a lot less going on environment-wise. You don't have constant streets or cars going by, so it is a lot easier to play the game without the mini-map. Now, while I haven't played Red Dead Redemption 2 yet, reading it and checking out some videos about it, it seems like Rockstar has again gone back a few steps for the sequel that do make it necessary to have the minimap open during various missions. Now, Nakey Jakey, who will have this clip here I'll show, in his video on Red Dead Redemption 2, mentioned that he heard that there would be an option that if the minimap had been turned off, you could get directions. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case with the end game.
Signs that give you directions and other landmarks to tell where you're going. And before the game came out, I remember seeing some rumor float around that if you play the game without the radar on, NPCs will actually give you directions for missions, and then you have to pay more attention to the game world itself instead of this little fucking circle in the corner.
And that's too bad, because it sounds like a really good way to take in that world. And Rockstar is just really disappointing me on that front. Now, let's jump ship a bit and take a look at the Far Cry series, one from Ubisoft that initially had a very good solution to the minimap. Going back to Far Cry 2, if you haven't played it, it's a mixed bag. It's both overrated and underrated, if that makes sense. But there's a great feature with the minimap that there is no minimap really. Instead, you hit a button and up you pull a map that's fairly detailed. And it's like Metal Gear Solid 5 in a way. And because you're not paused, you're still taking in your surroundings, and you have to always be on point. Which is really disappointing, because for Far Cry 3, they went backwards. It became the case of everything gets relegated to the corner, and it was full of so much information. And more or less, this is the same thing with other Ubisoft titles like Assassin's Creed, and it continued. I mean, the game did sell like gangbusters, so why would they change with it? But again, it's a thing where try turning off the minimap and you're completely lost. Now, for some improvements, Ubisoft has made their way towards the quest markers for Far Cry 5 and for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And this is great. But while it is better, there are still some issues when it comes to the quest marker. We're going to look at Bethesda games, and even before we jump into the quest marker, let's look a bit back before it started to get implemented in Oblivion with Elder Scrolls. Morrowind, which funny enough, had a tiny minimap in your corner that really didn't help. But it didn't really matter. The way they structured the world, the way quests work, you need to mind your surroundings. You had to talk to people to find things. I'm sure anyone who's beat Morrowind or spent any time with Morrowind could take a piece of paper and draw out Balmora and tell you where each key individual is. And that's such a great thing. It really allowed you to take in that world as you became more familiar with it. But unfortunately, again, it moved away from this towards the quest marker. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do prefer the quest marker over the minimap because it's the way it's laid out. Your eyes are much more on the visuals around you as opposed to one corner. But it still takes you quite a bit out of it, and it could be frustrating and somewhat amusing that these arrows could take you exactly to where you need to go. And it's really too bad, because as beautiful as these worlds are in Oblivion and Skyrim, they're just far less memorable than they were in Morrowind. And let's take an example. So, any quest basically, but let's look at one of the first quests for the Dark Brotherhood. You're given 3 contracts, and they're spread out across the world. Yet, the arrows are right to where they are, exactly. You just have to go there, and there they are. There's no real work involved to it besides killing them. Now, imagine if this quest were in Morrowind, how much more interesting it would be. You'd be given a general idea of where they're located. You go to this location, you would ask people, you get some ideas of who they are or what they look like. That would be much more earned. But Unfortunately, in those kind of situations in Oblivion or Skyrim, you're just following an arrow to it. If you try playing without the arrow, it's more difficult, and you can really realize that how much this game is being built around having that quest marker enabled. Now, to be fair, there are some fan-made mods that allow for better quest objectives, but again, it's a classic case of fans fixing things for Bethesda, which I really hope change after the issues with Fallout 76. And secondly, again, this comes back to design fail right off the bat, where it's being built into the game. So instead of the quest marker just being there to help you out, the game's being built around the quest marker itself. Now, I did mention earlier that Ubisoft has stepped towards the quest marker, which I do think is more preferable than the minimap. But it's a step in the right direction, but it's still not addressing that core issue that comes from developing these games around the quest marker or the minimap. So, what could game developers do to address this problem even further? Let's give a few things, and my first one would be the return of directions. And like I said, with Morrowind, this was such a great thing compared to Skyrim or Oblivion. Having a general idea of where to go, following signs, you became aware of that world and you really earned it instead of just going right to an arrow. Now, there's a great point in Deus Ex Mankind Divided that's brought up in Mark Brown's excellent video about it, that people will give you direction. Even though it's on the minimap, people will give you the exact directions of where you need to go.
Characters are forthcoming with actual directions and street addresses. This guy, he says,
I traced our hacker snoop to an unrented apartment, top floor 33 Hull Avenue, just down the street. This guy walks by us every single day, probably.
And it's not like it needs to be a super complex, go 4 lefts then 3 rights, but just having something there, or at least in the journal itself. As I mentioned earlier, Morrowind did a really good job of that, and if you asked around, it could be tough sometimes to find things, but you still made it work. And another point, which again, Mark Brown's brought up in a great video, which is the weenie factor, which is something Disney brought up, but especially in Naughty Dog games, they have very clear visual guides of where you need to go. Now, to be said, this is of course a lot easier for Naughty Dog games because you're right on a rail the entire time, but there have been steps in the right direction. Now, Zelda Breath of the Wild, which of course does have a minimap, you could turn off and the game is built for it because they have these weenies. And not everything is filled to the brim with having something every 20 feet to do. And another thing that games should do is just have better visual direction. Now, while it's not an open world, it's not strictly linear, the BioShock games, or System Shock games, did a really good job with this. Yes, BioShock had that stupid quest arrow, but it was so clear where you needed to go, and the visuals made it that it was so difficult to get lost, and I rarely found myself looking back at the map. Now, I find a lot of these larger games, these large open worlds are just so, well, they're just not, they don't have these weenies, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I have to say, it is pretty funny to keep saying that word weenies over and over. Anyways, are things improving? Well, Ubisoft, as I mentioned, did make some steps towards it. There is the exploration mode in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which, while a step in the right direction, it is good to see. It takes less away from the quest objectives and makes you work for it a little bit more. And looking at the Cyberpunk 2077 demo footage, there's no mini-map, and instead they've gone with a fairly inconsequential, subtle quest marker that doesn't fill up the screen, which again is a much better case than like Witcher 3, which was making use of the minimap. So, wrapping up on this discussion of the quest marker and the minimaps, for the game player, if you're playing these games, ones that have minimap open worlds, try turning them off and see what happens. Are they playable? Do you realize how much time you're spending looking at the corner? And for the game designers, look back to the games of old. Try what I call the napkin test. You know, get a player to draw a certain area of the map, and you'll really realize how much they take in. If they're just staring at a mini-map, they're not going to. As I mentioned earlier with Morrowind, you could get so many gamers to just draw out off the top of their head the layout of Balmora. And that wasn't because they were using quest markers to find their way around. To wrap up this video, as I mentioned earlier, the quest marker and minimap is not as large an issue as other things in the game industry, but games can be too reliant on it, and it's something that needs to be addressed more. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been a fun video to do. If you like what you saw, comment, like, subscribe. I look forward to having more videos out soon. Any feedback you have is great. Thanks everyone. Boulder Punch out.